All right, good morning, everyone. It's a little sporadic, and this is Capstone, so good morning, everyone. Excellent. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event on NARA's own Capstone approach and an open question and answer session that we're going to have later on in the program this morning. My name is Paul Wester, and I'm the Chief Records Officer for the United States government, and I'm really thrilled that everyone has come out today to hear our presentation. As you know, NARA released Bulletin 2013-02, Guidance on a New Approach to Managing Email Records, also known as Capstone, in August of 2013. Considering the importance of email management in the federal government, we at NARA wanted to provide more information and more training about how this approach may work for your agency. We've had a lot of different training workshops that we've offered, individual meetings that we've had with agencies, and today we're going to share the approach and how we are implementing it here at the National Archives. So as part of today's event, we're going to be breaking the piece up into two pieces as the slide indicates. In section one, we will have a presentation on NARA's own implementation of the Capstone approach, led by NARA's Corporate Records Officer, Susan Sullivan, who's here in the front row. Susan is going to share information on how NARA planned its approach, stakeholder involvement, implementation steps to date, lessons learned that might help other agencies who are considering implementing their own Capstone approach. Questions and answers on her presentation will be gathered up and covered as part of the second panel that we're going to have this morning after a short break. So in section two, a panel of NARA email experts will be available to answer questions on NARA's approach as well as general questions on Capstone and email management. And we have folks that we've brought in from our email formats team, from research services, and a whole host of other parts of the National Archives as well as our own staff here. So I think it'll be a really good give and take with the folks here. Before we get started, I wanted to give a special thanks to Susan, who's been on the out on the bleeding edge in some cases on making this work from a records manager or records officer perspective. So I know you're all going to clap when she's done, but we should give her a big round before we start. So. And then special thanks to all the NARA staff who've been involved in inviting you to be here today, organizing the session, and getting things set up so that we can have a good presentation from Susan as well as the question and answer piece. So with that, I'm going to jump over to give you a little bit of level setting about the directive itself and the requirement around Capstone. So everyone in the room, I presume, has heard of the Managing Government Records memo from OMB and NARA. That's weak too, but that's all right. So that's Directive M1218, and one of the items within that directive is a goal that all federal agencies need to manage all of their email, both temporary and permanent email, electronically by the end of 2016. Within the directive, there's guidance to NARA, or direction to NARA, to develop new email guidance by the end of the calendar year 2013 for some new approaches to thinking about managing email and carrying out disposition within the different restrictions that we have, and that's part of what Susan's going to describe today. So then the Capstone Bulletin is what we put out to do that. We know there's a lot more activity that needs to be done with that, but that is the deliverable that we've accomplished so far. I want to talk a little bit about the Capstone approach itself. As opposed to managing series of records within different kinds of contexts, we want to manage email records at the account level. We're looking with the Capstone guidance in combination with other kinds of IT investments that agencies are making now to leverage these new technologies to better manage email from a business need within agencies, but then also to be able to get the permanently valuable records to the National Archives. And we want to allow for the disposition of clearly temporary accounts while identifying and capturing permanently valuable email accounts. And this is a combination of the Capstone policy itself, other concepts like flexible scheduling, which allows agencies to manage large bodies, particularly of temporary records, but permanent records as well, in multiple series so that we don't have to carry out individual specific disposition instructions on each individual file. This is a way to think about this at a higher level of aggregation with less human intervention involved in the process. I'm not sure how much of this you can see, but part of what we want to be able to convey to folks who are considering the Capstone approach is that if you view your agency or your department as a series of pyramids, the theory is there are parts of an agency that are more likely to have permanently valuable email records, particularly at the top of an organization, but also in different places throughout an organization. And what the capstone approach allows you to do by managing at the account level is to identify where you would draw a line across an agency above which all of the email records would be permanent, would be captured, and we would work with an agency to transfer them to the National Archives, and then below which we would work with an agency to identify different ways to cover the scheduling of those temporary records and other kinds of ways to gather the permanent records that may be created or received at other parts of an organization. So this is just a graphical representation to think about how you could conceive of this sort of issue within your agency. And I know as part of what Susan's going to talk about is some of this is like the easy thing conceptually, how this works. Susan's going to talk more about the nuts and bolts of how you can make these selections and identify who these capstone officials are and the kinds of technical things you need to think about as you're moving out with this kind of an approach. And we will also be able to go into more detail about that as part of the question and answer session. So with that, we're going to bring Susan Sullivan up here, and she is going to give the presentation on the NARA implementation of Capstone. Take it away, Susan.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Glad to see you here. Glad the weather cooperated. And glad January 31st is come and gone. How many of you are involved in preparing and submitting all the materials for the SAO reports? Show of hands. A little bit of a funny story. So our records management self-assessment, we drafted in paper, and we used a Word document, and we circulated it. And it was finally blessed and vetted and ready to go. And it was Friday afternoon, about 2:30. And I was rereading the submittal guidance, and then I realized those answers needed to be submitted in a survey tool. So I had to go and actually find the link, bring up the survey tool, and I input the answers that were vetted, but at the very last minute, and I almost missed it. So that just goes to show you that you got to pay attention. And there were so many items that were getting circulated for review that I forgot about the survey part. So, but hopefully, what I'm going to talk to you about today will help in completing that records management self-assessment in the future. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to tell you the story. This briefing has been written and rewritten a couple of times from a technical perspective, from a policy perspective. And this is more of a policy focus today, but on the 13th of February, I'm going to do a webinar that's a little more technical, tell you how many bytes and bits and formats and stuff like that. But this one today is going to be a little bit more about our experience, what we had to think about, how it started, just kind of a journey. What was our journey? So with that said, the NARA Corporate Records Management staff is situated organizationally in NARA under the Chief Operating Officer. And our Chief Operating Officer is over all of the executives in the agency. And so we kind of sitteth on the right hand of the Chief Operating Officer, and he is also our SAO. And he gives us a lot of clout. If we need anything, all we do is go to him. He gets in the executive team meeting, and he talks to the executives, and the executives move. So we find that to be very, very helpful and useful, and it's a good place to be situated. In the past, we were situated under the CIO. That was very advantageous as well because by default, we were involved in all the IT initiatives, and it's taken a little extra work not being under the CIO to make sure we're involved in those initiatives. So just a little side comment on our organization. Little history, our past policy was probably like everybody else's for email. It was print and file based on the content of the email, and each user was responsible for managing their own email based on the content. I would say in late 2009, early 2010, Our general counsel met with us and discussed with us at a high level the capstone policy. At that point, every time we talked about it, the requirements seemed to change. So what we did was we ran a little internal study, a little application, where we kind of tested user behavior with email. And what we found was that senior executives' email can be categorized as permanent, but many senior executives don't have or can't take the time to file their email manually. We learned that for the people in our study, if their email filing was assisted by search terms, they were able to file easier. We also learned that without the ability to have control over the email you file, there might be some concerns about PII, private information, and access to sensitive information within the email. We also learned that with minimal user input, we could actually capture email by role, meaning the person's role in the agency, with or without user input. So we developed some requirements, and these requirements that you see now are pretty standard. They come right out of the CFR. An immutable email management solution, which means, once they're filed, they're safe, they're not going to be changed. Integrated with the messaging system to allow capture of the content of the email as electronic records. You want the messages in an open format. You want the attachments and the associated metadata. And also, you want to be able to maintain the functionality and integrity of the content throughout their full life cycle. So this was pretty much the what we needed. Where it got a little more interesting was how to implement this. And this came out of a lot of conversations between corporate records management, general counsel, Paul Wester's group, the IT people. And what ended up in our request for proposal was language, this is paraphrased, but it was the ability to automatically capture email messages in an open format where automated rules can exclude some objects from capture, or where manual actions can override the automated rules in place. And this came out of our study that we did earlier, when we found that we needed to have some control, or the ability to have some control over what gets captured, but that control is actually optional. But if people want control, they can have control. The second thing was an automated rules-based approach to records management, which means the ability to establish records categorization rules and automatically categorize records for management, transfer, and disposition. So we wanted the ability to use automated rules to capture and manage our records. That said, we formed a team. We formed a team shortly after our system was procured. We procured a system that was comprised of Google Apps, Gmail, and DoD 5015 certified RMA, both in the cloud, both with the ability to interoperate. So in order to manage this whole process, we formed a team comprised of my group, Corporate Records Management, General Counsel, Big Player, Chief Information Officer staff, including the contracting officer representative and the project manager, Paul Wester's folks, several of them, and members of senior leadership were involved in every step of the process. As part of that team, this is what I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to talk to you about the work of that team and what we did, and pretty much in the order that I'm presenting it. So we had to define who the capstone accounts were going to be. And so what we did was we identified about 48 staff members, agency head, the deputy, the C-level officials, because we do have a C-level in our agency now, the chief information officer, chief operating officer, chief human capital officer, the executives, the directors of major programs, and for NARA, the presidential library directors. And those are typically who we identified as our senior officials whose records would be considered permanent. Everybody else in the agency, including contractors, volunteers, anybody with an email account would be considered temporary. And then there's the corpus of non-records. The next thing we had to do was figure out how these applications worked. How did they talk to each other? What were our options? And I will tell you here, the technology will influence some of your decisions. So I would recommend you being involved in the procurement and analysis of any tools that you procure, because you don't want to get stuck with a decision or with a technology that doesn't do what you need it to do. So initially we were faced with what we thought was two choices: journaling, which is capture upon sent and receipt, or mailbox crawling. And this gets a little complicated, so I'm going to try to keep it simple. Journaling is basically used for e-discovery purposes and captures everything that's sent and received. We do that. We have, it goes all into the archives in the part of the application, and it probably doesn't look like this or isn't called this, but I call it the journal. Everything gets stored in one place. Then we implemented what we called mailbox crawling. And this was something that we actually had to push for, because what happens is then after the messages are journaled and they're stored, then the crawler goes into the user's mailboxes and it allows users, it acts on user actions. In the case of Gmail, labels, for example. So for mailbox crawling, this helped us implement the ability for users to actually have some say over how their email gets managed. Our crawlers are set up to act on rules. They act on labels, and I'll explain this in a minute. They exclude anything that's labeled as non-record, deleted, draft, or spam. Now, that software application automatically skips the deleted, draft, or spam email messages. It also supports what we call safe harbor, which I'll explain in a minute, but just briefly, safe harbor is a time period prior to capture where users may or may not act on their email, depending on what they want to do. One thing that we had to deal with the crawling is it required some extra security, because the crawler actually goes into and accesses users' mailboxes. And I don't know necessarily the technical details of that, but just a little heads up on that. The next thing we had to decide was the scope. What were we going to capture? And again, the technology had a lot to do with these decisions, because the technology that we purchased could go into mailboxes and calendars and crawl those and capture those automatically. So because of that capability, that was acceptable to us. It captures email messages and attachments, calendars and appointments, tasks that are part of the calendar, and if a user moves a chat transcript into their mailbox, it'll capture that as well. Then we had to identify an effective date, because when was this all going to take effect? So we identified January 22nd, 2013 as the effective date. So anything created or received after the 21st, that's when we turned on the crawlers. So you can imagine the crawler has some logic behind it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So we had to think about our legacy content, and don't underestimate your legacy content. This is something you really need to think about what you're going to do with that. So if it was sent or received before the effective date, our print and file policy still applies. However, because we did have the ability to, we had the RMA now, we had the capstone file plan. So once those items were crawled into the RMA or the archiving application, however you want to look at it, users could manually file those under Capstone. We left that as an option. Because we know that print and file may not have been applied consistency throughout the agency. So a little bit about Safe Harbor. Ironically, we implemented right around the time Edward Snowden came out, and people were very sensitive about personal information and their activities online and their communications. And what we found, and this is kind of interesting, people think their soul is in their email. It's who they are. It's what they feel. It's what they've said. It's their knee-jerks. It's their jokes. And they really would like to have some control over that. So we created what we called Safe Harbor. And I think this is something that came out of the Sonoma conference as well. This is a time period before the record-keeping capture that allows our users to delete useless non-records, to label as non-record information that they want to keep. So for example, I get a lot of information from listservs that I want to keep. So I label those non-record record-keeping information. And they don't get crawled, but they're saved for me in my Gmail, and I can access those whenever I want. If you are, by default, a temporary user, and you have an email that is permanently valuable, you can label your email permanent during the Gmail Safe Harbor. Conversely, on the RMA side, we have another Safe Harbor, which is a period of time within the archive or RMA that users can recategorize their information that was captured. So say something got in there by mistake or got captured in the wrong category by mistake, they can change it. There's a certain amount of time they can change it. They can even go and take, we brought in all of the legacy email into our, the Unified Archive application. It's not categorized as record, they're just convenience copies, but people can go into their RMA, they can do sorts, they can go in there and categorize those legacy emails as records if they want to during the Safe Harbor period. So just a little bit about the capture logic, because there were two ways we kind of broke down the way our email was managed. We call them capture rules and records declaration rules. This is the capture side. So the crawler goes out and looks in a user's mailbox and says, is it 90 days old? Yes. Is it non-record? No. Is it spam, draft, or trash? No. Capture it. If it's not yet 90 days old, it goes over it. If it's non-record, it doesn't capture it. If it's spam, draft, or trash, it doesn't capture it. So that's the capture logic in the crawler. Then you've got your records declaration policy, which is kind of a different flavor of auto-categorization. And it's not magic, it's not all that scientific. It's based on very simple rules. We feed the crawler the list of who are the permanent capstone senior officials, and we tell it, if it's from this person, it is by default filed as permanent, unless the person has labeled that record as temporary. Conversely, if the person is not on that list, by default, the file is declared as temporary unless it's labeled as permanent. So it's based on who the person is. It doesn't go beyond that list of individuals. Once we get past the capture rules exclude the non-records, and then this is just like your filing policy. So we had to specify a file plan in our records management application, and I will tell you, our vendors just couldn't believe that we only wanted 3 file categories for the whole agency. They were ready to put in a nice hierarchical file plan and dazzle us with all their capabilities. And it took us 4 weeks to get this through their heads, that this is what we wanted. So just to let you know, this is a new concept, and it takes people a while to get used to the whole idea. So just to let you know how we use these, as I said before, the permanent file folder is for the default for senior officials. And what else goes in there is anything labeled as permanent by those not identified as senior officials. It's also available for people to use to recategorize during the safe harbor period in the RMA, and for manually categorizing as permanent messages that were created before the effective date of capstone. Temporary is the same way, only for non-senior officials. And this is where we have actually the non-record folder in case messages get captured that are non-records in the RMA, and users want to move those into the non-record folder so that they don't get managed and saved as temporary or permanent records. So the non-record folder goes actually into the RMA as part of the file plan. So at this point, we had to communicate to our users. When you tell people that you're automatically capturing their email and saving them as temporary or permanent, some people get worried. So what we learned, at least at NARA, we used a combination platter of communications mechanisms. We have our intranet site where we created a capstone page, and we created a link to that, and we always had the news on there about what we were doing, how we were rolling it out, what to expect. We had briefings on there that explained, screenshots about how to set up your labels in Gmail, when the crawling was being turned on, the logic of the crawling, pretty much a lot of the information I'm giving you today. And what else we found was our blog. My blog we have an internal social media network called the ICN, and I blogged pretty much daily. And the blog works as kind of a teaser campaign. It gets people, it's a way to round people up and get them to come to that capstone page and read the guidance. You can put your briefings up there and everything. We have screens as you come into the archives. We had notices on there. We use the news on our intranet. And even to this day, I wish I had more capability and time to communicate this, because you can't communicate this enough. People miss it. It's got to be part of your training when people come into the agency. It's got to be part of your annual training. If this is how you're going to manage email kind of passively behind the scenes, people need to understand what you're doing, because you want them to accept it. They're going to be happy that they don't have to do the extra steps to manage the records. But a lot of people don't even think about this coming into the agency. So I can't underestimate or underemphasize the need to communicate. Then there were the nuances, because as part of our communications, our folks in the Chief Records Officer's office brought to our attention that sometimes your emails are part of a case file, and they still need to be printed and filed and managed with the related records. So that became a nuance that we had to emphasize and let people know that they were still responsible for including their email messages along with related records so that they could be part of the whole story in the case of, contract files, IT project files, things like that. But the good news is if people had to go back and get those records, they're available to create the case files. Another thing that was a pretty big project for us is we had to migrate the data from a former RMA that we had. And the challenge there was our former RMA was certified to like version 2 of DoD 5015.2, which did not require portability of data. So it was a little bit of a challenge to get the data out and get it transferred. Not only did we migrate it into the new system, but the first thing we did was we exported eligible records, many of them permanent, because we had records of the archivist in there, deputy archivist, and we actually pre-accessioned those into NARA's custodial unit, worked with them at the table. For the migration into our new RMA, we had to do a data dump and a complementary HTML just for validation purposes. And the migration, I'm going to be honest, wasn't pretty. Whenever it's in the new RMA, it doesn't really look like it did in the old RMA. The functionality is not quite the same. So if you have repositories that you need to migrate into your new repository, fully understand the requirements as part of your procurement. Understand how they're used for business. You might be surprised how people use information stored in a repository. They'll use it as a knowledge base. The access level can be very important. So if you need a departmental access, a whole group needs to access certain folders within a file plan, you need to make sure that your system can handle that. Another thing that we did was we drafted and submitted a schedule for our records, a capstone schedule. And just a little bit of the details of that. The cutoff is at the end of the fiscal year for the permanent records. And we will export and pre-accession those every year immediately after cutoff. They will stay in the system for 15 years, and then we'll transfer them to the National Archives holdings. That's the way it's drafted now. I don't know how it's going to be approved, but that's the way it's drafted now. Temporary are from the email accounts not designated as capstone officials. They are digital records. And right now, we've proposed a 7-year retention for those. And the system will automatically delete them after 7 years. We also drafted an internal directive, which is in draft right now. This is just kind of an outline of what went in there. And we will use this as the basis for the training that we roll out. We explain the capstone approach. We explain how we're managing the records of the designated capstone officials and the records of people that are not capstone. We talk about the exceptions, using the labeling, using Safe Harbor, how to label your email messages as non-records, the need to retain email messages with related records, other considerations such as having multiple email accounts and using personal email accounts are addressed in that capstone directive. Essentially, we say that they need to transcribe those messages. If they're even a phone message, put it in the email system, forward the message to yourself. This is something that people need to know, especially in training. So we decided that the capstone policy was a good place to put this. And then every one of our policy has a records paragraph where we talk about maintaining the records generated by that policy. Further, whenever we procured the new system and we're getting ready to migrate to Gmail, I put out a request for two detail employees. I brought in a full-time employee from our ERA program and part-time from the custodial unit. And they worked with me for almost a year. And then we issued the actual position, which goes a little bit beyond Capstone, because this person is now our electronic records management specialist. So this person will actually work with the contractors to administer our RMA. They will run searches and sorts and do analysis and evaluate the success of our Capstone program, help us make adjustments, make suggestions. They will contribute to our governance and strategy and training initiatives. This is our point of contact for all of these types of things. This person's responsible for maintaining record schedules for electronic information management systems. So this person is the one that's out there talking to project managers and IT system owners about getting record-keeping requirements integrated, and making sure that all of the new systems are identified and record-keeping requirements are implemented in them. So they're really our ERM special. This person is really our ERM specialist in the program, and this is a new position that we just filled late last year. So this is the summary. It's not in exactly the order of importance, but as Paul mentioned, well, I guess this is the most important thing. When Paul's group issued the Capstone Bulletin, it was very helpful to us because it provided us a lot of validation, and it was something to hang our hat on, because we had been moving forward knowing this was coming, but, kind of we had the whole concept, but having it in writing was a huge help. We adopted the new email system because the email system that we had was not reliable anymore. The format was proprietary. We couldn't really save email messages easily in a record-keeping system. We had studied the Capstone approach and identified the requirements pretty clearly. We didn't just take it on its face. We actually tested it with user behavior, and we learned a lot of good lessons. And then we took the step, and we actually implemented the approach to managing email. It made filling out the records management self-assessment so much easier, because we're getting much closer to fulfilling the requirements of the new OMB Electronic Government Records Directive. Obviously, we subscribe to Gmail, the RMA that we're using, RMA/archiving system, and I will say, these systems have kind of evolved. Back in the day, I don't know, I don't want to put a time frame on it. These systems were basically a repository. They were a system that had folders with records retention schedules applied to them, and the difficulty was in creating file plans in them and getting people to right-click Save As into these systems. But now these systems have evolved. They have crawlers attached to them. They have journaling capabilities. They have the repository to store things with the record-keeping information. They have the ability to do the whole ball of wax that you need to do for information management. But you have to understand exactly how they work with the systems you have in place and how your users are going to actually use them. That said, this does help us comply with Section 1.2 of the Presidential Directive. And we obviously had to pick a start date and demarcate when our Capstone policy began. Moving forward, as I said, we submitted a record schedule. And in review, we have about 48 permanent accounts that the email records will eventually be transferred to NARA's archival holdings. The temporary accounts right now are currently proposed to be retained for 7 years. What are our lessons learned? Don't forget about your existing repositories when you go out for RFP or RFI. identify what you have and what you want to migrate, and be explicit. Because when we went out, our RFP said something about migrating all existing archives. Well, technically, our old RMA wasn't considered an archive by our contractor. So we ended up having to add that onto our contract. And there was a lot of extra work there that was unplanned for. But in the end, we got it done. Establish a common understanding with your vendors and your contractors. This takes work. Sit down and develop your requirements. And they're really configuration requirements. You know what the system can do. How do you want it set up? What's the outcome you want to achieve? And go over the requirements with your vendors line by line and make sure they understand what you're saying and what you mean and why you're saying it. It took, I would say, 4 very long meetings to get there. We fed them the requirements in paper. They fed them back to us, translated. No, that's not right. It took some work. Like I said to our vendors, archive is a verb. So there's a little gap there, but they came around. It took a while, but it's really important. And understand that user communication is very important. Their soul is in their email. It's very, very personal, very personal. That's why you need to, if you're going to capture all the legacy email, give them some extra time to manage it, to clean it out. Let them know ahead of time, before you even do the procurement. You're going to do a procurement. Clean up your email. We did do that. Some people did, some people didn't. We even gave them example of searches and roles they could do in our old email system to clean out things that we knew were broadcast messages. Things like that. And like I said, some people did it, some people didn't. You're going to need to establish your schedule and your policies. And again, can't say it enough. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. And it might sound complex, but when I'm standing here right now looking back at it, it all was pretty much common sense stuff that you needed to do all along the way. I just hope that you can benefit a little bit from our experience, because in the end, I think it's a worthwhile thing to do, and it does help solve a very big problem in managing email records. Like Paul said earlier, we're going to have a panel discussion next. I hope you don't mind holding your questions until then. I know I didn't necessarily cover everything. My next speech will be via webinar on February 13th. It'll be a little more technical. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And we'll see you in about 15 minutes.